I stepped out of the sleek black sedan and adjusted the hem of my dress, taking a deep breath to steady myself. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows over the manicured lawns of my fiancé's family home in suburban Chicago. The scent of fresh-cut grass mixed with the subtle aroma of flowers arranged for the rehearsal dinner, a reminder that today was supposed to be celebratory. My hands trembled slightly, not from nerves about marrying, but from anticipating the undercurrents that had always seemed to swirl whenever I stepped into this family space. I could hear laughter drifting from the open doors, faint but carrying the crisp cadence of affluent households, polished but brittle. As I entered, I caught my fiancé's warm smile. It was quiet, reassuring, the kind of calm he always offered when my mind raced. He gave me a small nod, a gesture that silently said he believed in me even when others didn't. My heart lifted just enough to keep the tension from consuming me entirely. As I moved through the room, I noticed her first, my fiancé's sister. She lingered near the doorway, an elegant posture but eyes sharp, scanning me like a judge measuring worth. A subtle roll of her eyes, a barely audible whisper that ended with a faint chuckle. It was familiar, a prelude I had learned to recognize over the years. Guests around us exchanged polite glances, some tucking uneasy smiles behind raised glasses. I offered greetings, my tone even, careful not to betray the familiar pinch of anxiety. Each step I took through the room reinforced the duality of excitement and apprehension. This was my wedding celebration, yet here, at the center of it, lay a test of my poise and composure. I caught snippets of conversation as I approached the table where my fiancé stood. A distant relative commented on the weather, another on the food, small talk layered over the weight of familial tension. I observed every micro-expression, the subtle lift of a brow, the flick of a hand, the almost imperceptible smirk on my sister-in-law's lips. She was skilled, practiced in her dismissal, and I felt the familiar knot in my stomach tighten. My internal monologue sifted through memories of past gatherings, of my efforts to be seen, acknowledged, valued, and how often they had been met with indifference or thinly veiled mockery. I reminded myself to breathe, to hold steady, to not let this dim the anticipation of my own milestone. As I moved to greet a small group near the floral archway, I felt the slight brush of a whispered comment, laced with sarcasm. It was enough to make me pause and carefully measure my response. Years of experience in managing professional conflicts, subtle manipulations, and social power plays flashed in my mind. I reminded myself that my worth wasn't determined by anyone else's opinion, yet the sting of being publicly undermined was immediate, sharp, undeniable. The atmosphere shifted imperceptibly. The pace of conversation slowed as tension coiled among the guests. I kept my voice light, smiled faintly, and reminded myself that observation was power. Patience, my ally. Then she spoke. "He can marry anyone, do anything." The words cut through the murmurs of conversation like a cold blade, directed at me with precision. Laughter rippled awkwardly from the corner where she stood, polished and knowing, her gaze locked on mine. I froze for the fraction of a second, feeling the heat of embarrassment rise to my cheeks. Guests shifted uncomfortably, some averting eyes, others meeting mine with quiet sympathy. My mind raced, parsing through decades of being undervalued, of being compared unfavorably, dismissed, and sidelined. I forced myself to inhale, to center, to respond with controlled elegance rather than immediate rebuttal. Inside, a spark ignited, a mental plan forming, strategic and deliberate, to assert myself without yielding to impulsive confrontation. I noticed subtle reactions around me. A cousin's tight-lipped grimace, a friend's faint nod of understanding, my fiancé's brief glance, apologetic yet supportive. Her smirk widened, perfectly composed, asserting dominance in a room now tense with silent anticipation. I let a small, measured smile cross my lips, not of defeat, but of quiet awareness. I cataloged allies and potential adversaries in the room, assessing who might see through her act, who might judge me unfairly, and how I could navigate this without public spectacle. I reminded myself that strength was in patience, in observation, in letting strategy lead over raw emotion. Retreating momentarily to the side, I found a small corner near the drink table, a brief sanctuary from the social theater. I sipped water, letting it calm the nervous flutter in my stomach, and reflected on the journey that had brought me here. Years of compromise, quiet labor, and sacrifices that often went unnoticed. My fiancé's supportive glance reached me across the room, a tiny anchor of hope in the swirl of humiliation. It reminded me that not all eyes were judging, that even amid derision, loyalty and affection persisted. I began quietly to sketch potential strategies, subtle ways to assert my position, to claim respect without triggering outright conflict. Every thought was a calculation, every breath measured. As the evening continued, she didn't relent, though her provocations became subtler, pointed remarks disguised as questions, a faint sneer when others laughed, a tilted head that implied judgment. I noticed these shifts, cataloged them, and allowed my mind to wander to future moves. There was no need for immediate confrontation. Patience amplified impact. Yet, each slight propelled a simmering determination within me, a quiet commitment to demonstrate competence, intelligence, and resilience. My mind was alive with possibilities, planning, observing, reacting internally while maintaining outward calm. The guests began moving toward the dinner tables, conversation resuming around the clinking of glasses. I followed at a measured pace, noting alliances and unspoken judgments. Her eyes flicked to mine once more, a sharp glimmer of awareness that I had noticed the provocation. The tension had not dissipated. It had transformed into a contained current, running beneath smiles and polite chatter. I felt a surge of clarity. This event, meant to celebrate love and union, was also an arena, and I had the tools to navigate it without losing dignity. I caught a whisper between two relatives, a half-joked comment about my calm demeanor, a soft acknowledgement that my composure was remarkable. It fueled the resolve simmering beneath my measured exterior. The room felt smaller, more intimate, every glance charged with implication, and yet I maintained poise. Even as she sent another subtle, pointed look my way, I knew that her dominance was temporary, that observation and strategy were mine to wield. I stepped to my fiancé's side, letting a reassuring hand brush mine, a quiet signal of solidarity. I would not be undone by ridicule. This was my milestone, my celebration, and while the first cracks of familial tension had emerged, I held firm. I allowed myself a measured exhale, acknowledging the discomfort but refusing to surrender to it. Thoughts of later conversations, subtle counters, and carefully considered actions danced in my mind. I was not powerless. I was calculating, poised, and unshakable. As the rehearsal dinner commenced, I took my seat with eyes alert, ears tuned, every sense attuned to social nuance. Laughter, clinking cutlery, soft conversation, each sound layered over the undercurrent of tension. I knew the night was far from over, that further provocations would test patience and resolve. Yet even in this early humiliation, a spark of empowerment flickered. Quiet, patient, intelligent, unwavering. I had survived the first wave. I would endure the rest, not with defeat, but with deliberate strategy, inner strength, and a mind attuned to every subtle shift in the room. After the dinner plates were cleared and the soft glow of evening lamps replaced the late afternoon light, I followed my fiancé into the lounge area, a space that smelled faintly of polished wood and lingering perfume. The air had shifted from the structured formality of the dining room to a more relaxed, yet no less treacherous social environment. Guests mingled in small clusters, exchanging anecdotes and laughter that seemed a touch too rehearsed. I noticed immediately how my sister-in-law positioned herself near the center of attention, tilting her head and laughing at remarks that were barely worth noting, subtly drawing eyes away from me. Her movements were deliberate, measured, designed to keep the focus on her while diminishing my presence. I forced a small smile, letting my observations settle in, mentally cataloging the patterns I had grown accustomed to. As I engaged with a few relatives, exchanging polite remarks and nods, she struck, as if rehearsed, a faint interruption in my flow. I mentioned an achievement from work, only for her to rephrase it aloud with a sarcastic inflection, turning it into a triviality. "Oh, you managed that little project? Impressive, I guess," she said, eyes glinting with mischief. The other guests chuckled politely, none fully registering the weight of her dismissal. I felt the familiar tightening in my chest, the sting of being belittled in public, but kept my tone even, my smile measured. I noted mentally who witnessed this, the potential allies and bystanders, and began silently documenting every subtle slight for a future, calculated response. It was a dance I knew well: endure, observe, plan. Each of her words was a test of composure, and I would not fail. Then came an unintended reinforcement. A distant cousin, perhaps unaware of the undercurrent, asked a patronizing question, echoing the sister's diminishment. "So you really handled all that on your own? That must have been challenging for someone with your background," they said, as if confirming her insinuation. My jaw tightened, but I maintained outward calm, inwardly cataloging yet another marker of social isolation. I felt the familiar flare of irritation, a blend of recognition and exasperation, tempered by a strategic patience that had been honed over years of navigating subtle slights. These small acts, seemingly innocuous, stacked upon one another, shaping the invisible hierarchy that I had long since learned to read and anticipate. Finding a quiet corner of the lounge, I allowed myself a moment of reflection. I considered my options carefully. To confront now would escalate unnecessarily, risking the decorum expected in this room. Instead, I visualized a more measured approach, a way to assert my dignity while maintaining composure. Mentally, I replayed each interaction, noting gestures, tones, and facial expressions, essentially building a dossier in my mind. My fiancé approached, offering a brief, supportive touch on my arm, a subtle reminder that I was not alone. His presence anchored me, giving me space to transform humiliation into empowerment, to convert irritation into strategic thinking. I began to see not just the slight, but the opportunity. Patience, observation, and precise action could turn these moments to my advantage. Throughout the lounge, my sister-in-law continued her subtle provocations, inserting comments disguised as curiosity or casual observations, testing boundaries, noting reactions. Each statement was a thread, weaving tension into the fabric of the evening. I listened carefully, measuring when to engage and when to observe silently. The room's undercurrent was clear, the social dynamics shifting subtly but persistently, yet I remained grounded. My mind cataloged her behavior and the reactions of those around, calculating potential allies and those who might unknowingly side with her. Quietly, I began plotting small countermeasures, not confrontational, but sufficient to assert presence and credibility when the right moment arose. By the time the evening progressed toward a quieter lull, I felt a simmering determination. The provocations were not over, they were merely paused, waiting for the right moment to escalate. Her eyes met mine from across the room, a small, almost imperceptible smirk forming, a reminder that the challenge had not ended. I met her gaze with a composed, deliberate expression, signaling that her attempts to destabilize me would not succeed. The evening, meant to be informal, had become a subtle battlefield of social positioning, and I was now fully engaged, mentally prepared, and strategically patient. Each action and reaction was recorded, each slight noted, each gesture analyzed. The subtle undermining would not go unchecked, and I would ensure that when the time came, I would respond with precision, intellect, and calm authority. The terrace was quieter than the lounge, the hum of the remaining guests muted under the soft glow of outdoor lights. I stepped out for a moment of clarity, letting the cool evening air settle my thoughts while my fiancé lingered behind, talking with a few colleagues. From my vantage point, I could see my sister-in-law weaving through small groups, her presence commanding subtle attention, laughter hanging lightly in the air, but pointedly at the expense of others. Her eyes found mine several times, each glance sharp, testing, measuring. I breathed evenly, cataloging each movement, noting who followed her lead and who remained neutral. Patterns I had seen before were now unmistakable. This was no accidental slight. Every small action, every redirected conversation, it all served a purpose. I let the frustration simmer beneath the surface, keeping my voice calm, my expressions controlled, all while mentally mapping out the social terrain and my potential responses. Soon, she approached a small cluster of guests where I had been contributing to a conversation. In a tone as casual as a summer breeze, she misquoted my recent work accomplishment, twisting it into something trivial and almost laughable. "Oh, she just handled that tiny project by herself? How ambitious," she said, her smirk just enough to draw soft chuckles from those standing nearby. I felt a familiar tightening in my chest, the recognition of subtle sabotage that left me both irritated and cautious. I forced a polite nod, choosing silence over confrontation, all the while storing every word, every nuance, in memory for the day when it would be addressed with precision. She leaned back slightly, satisfied with her manipulation, while I adjusted my stance, projecting calmness even as indignation flared quietly beneath the surface. Moments later, I realized I had been subtly excluded from a different conversation on the opposite side of the terrace. Her laughter drew attention from a small group, shifting the flow of dialogue to topics I had introduced only moments before. Guests, caught in the web of social hierarchy, engaged with her instead, leaving me on the periphery. I stood there briefly, observing, allowing a controlled anger to surface. Not the hot burn of impulsive reaction, but a cold, strategic patience. I catalogued who had ignored me, who remained attentive, and who might serve as allies in future interactions. Past patterns of being overlooked emerged vividly in my memory, reinforcing the need for meticulous planning rather than spontaneous retaliation. Across the terrace, my fiancé's quiet smile faltered slightly as he listened to her ambiguous remarks. I could sense his discomfort. He wanted to intervene, but lacked awareness of the full extent of her manipulation. I stepped closer, offering a light touch to his arm, a silent anchor, a reassurance for both of us. In that brief contact, I communicated steadiness, resolve, and the unspoken message that we were aligned, that he needn't act rashly while I assessed the situation. Internally, I considered ways to protect him from her influence, ensuring our dynamic remained intact without drawing unnecessary attention or creating public drama. Each comment, each glance, was a test, and I would meet it not with emotion alone, but with strategy. I moved toward a quieter corner, letting the space allow a moment of reflection. I considered potential counteractions, timing, subtle evidence collection, and well-placed dialogue to assert credibility and presence. Every minor slight from the evening became data points, misquotes, exclusions, insinuations. I planned to weave them together, not for immediate confrontation, but for a precise, controlled assertion that would establish my position firmly while maintaining decorum. My mind worked methodically, turning irritation into empowerment, frustration into tactical insight. Each guest, each reaction, was a piece of the puzzle, and I was quietly assembling the board for when the right move could be made. By the time I glanced back toward the center of the terrace, her eyes found mine again, a smirk curling at the edge of her lips. The challenge was clear. She intended to continue testing boundaries, to escalate the subtleties into something more consequential. I returned her gaze with calm intensity, signaling that her games would not destabilize me. The terrace, bathed in the muted glow of lamps and moonlight, had become a stage for quiet conflicts and measured maneuvering. And in that suspended moment, I knew the escalation was only beginning, that the next act would demand my full vigilance, intelligence, and strategic patience. The evening's lessons were clear: observe, plan, endure, and when the time was right, act decisively. The dining room was warm, the low hum of conversation mixing with the clinking of silverware. I stepped in carefully, aware of every glance, every subtle movement around me. The table was set meticulously, yet the arrangement itself felt like a battlefield. My sister-in-law had positioned herself near my fiancé, effortlessly occupying the space of influence, while I found myself seated slightly to the side. I took note of every potential ally and silent observer, mentally cataloging who might notice if tensions flared. I reminded myself to breathe evenly, to maintain poise, even as a quiet irritation began to build beneath the surface. This gathering, small as it was, carried the weight of unspoken hierarchies, past grievances, and subtle power plays that were only visible to the vigilant eye. During the early exchanges, my sister-in-law launched a veiled challenge, her voice smooth and lightly humorous. I hear you handled the Henderson project all on your own, she said, emphasizing all in a tone that suggested I had somehow overreached. Laughter rippled softly around the table, polite but pointed, leaving me momentarily taken aback. I suppressed the initial sting, cataloging her misrepresentation carefully. This was not just casual teasing, it was strategic, intended to cast doubt on my competence in front of those who mattered. I maintained my composure, nodding politely, responding with measured acknowledgement, while inwardly preparing to address this with precision at the right time. The next wave of tension arrived indirectly. A guest, prompted subtly by my sister-in-law's comments, began questioning my decisions during a recent work project, with a tone that was both curious and patronizing. The question, innocent on the surface, carried the weight of suggestion, that perhaps I was inexperienced, that my achievements might be overstated. I could feel the eyes of the room on me, and I measured every reaction, noting who seemed to accept the insinuation and who remained neutral. Instead of responding defensively, I allowed myself a brief internal smile, recognizing the manipulation, and resolved to use this moment to reinforce my presence in a calm, calculated manner later. I reached for my glass of water, only to knock it slightly against the edge of the table, spilling a small amount. My sister-in-law's eyes flicked toward me, and without missing a beat, she exaggerated the moment with a laugh that carried just enough mockery to catch attention. A few guests glanced my way, eyebrows raising ever so slightly. I felt a flash of embarrassment, but I quickly anchored myself in my awareness, turning the faux pas into a quiet lesson on perception and patience. There was no need for immediate reaction. Every action I observed, every slight she orchestrated, was an opportunity to plan a more impactful response. Taking a step back into the corner near the window, I allowed myself a moment to regroup mentally. I outlined subtle strategies for counteracting her influence, both publicly and privately. How could I assert my credibility without escalating the situation unnecessarily? Which allies could be quietly enlisted? Timing, evidence, and composure would be my tools. My fiancé offered a small, supportive glance from across the room, grounding me, reminding me that I was not facing this alone. The frustration I had felt transformed into strategic patience, a readiness to act at precisely the right moment. As the evening progressed, I caught her gaze from across the room. Her smile was ambiguous, almost calculating, hinting at further tests and future provocations. I returned the look steadily, signaling that I was aware, prepared, and not easily unsettled. Beneath the polite conversation and gentle laughter, the air crackled with hidden tension, a silent prelude to the confrontations that would follow. I knew that what had seemed like small, private skirmishes this evening would set the stage for larger, more visible conflicts to come. The awareness sharpened me. I was no longer merely reacting. I was anticipating, readying myself for decisive, intelligent action when the moment demanded it. Tonight was just the prelude, and I would ensure that I was both seen and respected when the true reckoning arrived. The evening had taken on a sharper edge, though the room itself remained warmly lit and filled with the murmur of polite conversation. I leaned against the edge of the living room doorway, taking in the subtle interactions, watching as my sister-in-law moved through the crowd like a conductor, orchestrating glances and gestures with quiet precision. Every laugh, every nod, every tilt of her head was calculated, designed to undermine without overt confrontation. I felt the familiar tension coil inside me, a mixture of frustration and determination. My fiancé hovered nearby, his brow furrowed, offering silent reassurances with a glance or a hand on my arm. I appreciated the gesture, but I knew the real work, the careful assessment of social currents, was mine to handle. Later, as I stepped onto the backyard patio, I found a moment of relative privacy. I spoke to my sister-in-law in measured tones, addressing the pattern of subtle jabs and manipulations without accusation. "I've noticed certain comments lately that could be misunderstood," I said lightly, ensuring my words carried calm authority rather than anger. She tilted her head, her eyes narrowing slightly, as though weighing my assertion. I catalogued every flicker of expression, every tiny reaction, noting that my words had landed with weight without needing to escalate. There was a satisfaction in quietly setting boundaries, a reinforcement of my own presence, asserting that the rules of engagement had shifted, even if only slightly. The tension, however, did not dissipate. Moments later, I observed her inserting sly comments into group conversation, innocuous on the surface but loaded with insinuation. A friend remarked on a minor error I had made earlier in the evening, and I could see the subtle influence behind the remark. The eyes of some guests flicked toward me, curiosity mingling with judgment, while others remained oblivious. I absorbed it all in silence, resisting the urge to react immediately, realizing that patience and observation would yield greater leverage than hasty defense. Each interaction became a mental map of alliances, weaknesses, and opportunities. Suddenly, my fiancé approached, his expression tense. He had overheard a snippet of my sister-in-law's private conversation, enough to understand that her manipulations were directed not just at me, but also at him. He whispered cautiously, suggesting a way to address the situation without creating spectacle. I nodded, silently appreciating his support while assessing the risk. The stakes had risen. What had been subtle nudges were now edged with the potential for public conflict. I felt a quiet surge of resolve, recognizing that careful strategy, rather than emotional reaction, would preserve dignity and control. As the night stretched on, I retreated briefly to the edge of the patio, reviewing everything in my mind. I considered how best to respond. Timing, context, and social perception all mattered. I weighed the possibility of gathering further subtle evidence, the right moment to assert influence, and the balance between confrontation and patience. My focus sharpened, frustration transformed into calculated empowerment. I was no longer merely enduring. Each slight, each manipulative maneuver was now part of a mental ledger, a game of foresight where measured action would determine the next advantage. Before I rejoined the group, my sister-in-law caught my gaze from across the patio. Her smile was ambiguous, almost teasing, signaling that she was aware of my awareness and, perhaps, anticipating my next move. A silent challenge hung between us, charged with unspoken rules and stakes that extended beyond the evening. I held her gaze with steady calm, letting her know, without words, that I would meet her provocations with intelligence and restraint. The night had become a study in subtle power, a test of patience, observation, and strategic planning. I knew the next confrontation would demand precision, and I was ready to act when the moment arrived. The morning light filtered softly through the blinds, yet the events of the previous evening weighed heavily on me. I sat at the kitchen table, a notebook open before me, though my pen hovered in hesitation. Every exchange, every glance from my sister-in-law replayed vividly, each manipulation catalogued in my mind. She had assumed subtle superiority, believing I would quietly absorb her provocations. Today, that pattern would shift. I began to outline measured responses, noting which allies among our friends and neighbors might lend subtle support or at least bear witness to the interactions. My fiancé hovered nearby, offering quiet observations, his concern evident but tempered by the knowledge that overreaction would play into her hands. My own anxiety settled into focused determination. I would act with precision, not impulse. By late afternoon, our informal family gathering was underway. I engaged with the room calmly, positioning myself where conversations naturally flowed through me rather than around me. I initiated a light-hearted story related to our shared work experiences, weaving in humor and intelligence to re-establish presence. Midway, my sister-in-law interjected with a sly comment meant to diminish the significance of my accomplishments. I met her interruption with a measured smile, acknowledging her remark while reinforcing my point with a subtle yet firm clarification. The effect was immediate. The room paused, noticing my composed confidence. I felt a cautious surge of empowerment, recognizing that assertion need not be loud to be effective. Her response was swift and calculated. Over the next hour, she circulated a whisper campaign among family, friends, and neighbors, seeding small distortions of my previous statements. Each comment, each raised eyebrow, subtly suggested incompetence or oversight. Observers began forming impressions, some influenced by her insinuations, others watching my measured demeanor with curiosity. I absorbed the nuances, recognizing which interactions required intervention and which could be left to settle naturally. My internal monologue cataloged every behavior, forming a tactical map of her strategies and vulnerabilities. My fiancé, sensing the growing tension, stepped in with careful timing. He navigated between the subtle skirmishes, offering support without creating spectacle. A gentle word here, a guiding hand there. He mediated, signaling solidarity while diffusing potential escalations. I observed his interventions closely, assessing both the benefits and the potential pitfalls of his approach. His quiet support reinforced my strategy, reminding me that measured collaboration was as vital as individual resolve. As the evening progressed, I evaluated the impact of my initial actions. My subtle pushback had shifted the social current, forcing her to reconsider the ease of her manipulations. I noted her slight hesitation, the fleeting doubt in her smirk, and began planning subsequent maneuvers that could further secure my standing without confrontation. Every gesture, every glance, every conversational cue became data for future strategic deployment. Confidence replaced frustration, and empowerment emerged through careful, deliberate calculation. Before retiring for the night, I noticed her glancing at me from across the patio with that same cryptic smile that had become all too familiar. It was both a warning and a challenge, an unspoken message that the next escalation would be public and deliberate. I met her gaze with quiet composure, letting her understand that I had acknowledged the threat and was ready. The night had transformed from subtle observation to active engagement. The battle lines were drawn, and I stood firmly in my ground, prepared for the confrontations the following chapters promised. The evening air carried a faint chill as I moved through the living room, already alert to the slightest shift in the room's energy. Every glance, every whispered comment from my sister-in-law had taught me vigilance. Tonight, I anticipated her every move. I revisited each interaction from the prior night in my mind, noting her subtle tells, tightened lips, a fleeting smirk, the quick glance toward a potential ally. My heart pounded lightly with suspense, but the pulse of anxiety was tempered by the confidence I had been cultivating. This was the moment to solidify my presence and prepare for the public confrontation I had both dreaded and expected. I moved through the guests, positioning myself strategically, observing, analyzing. Every face became a point on a map, every conversation a piece of potential leverage. My fiancé hovered nearby, a steady anchor, offering advice and subtle cues that reinforced my plan without making it obvious. I felt the calm determination settle over me. Preparation and foresight were my weapons tonight. It began subtly. A conversation at the patio, friends and colleagues casually gathered, laughter punctuating the evening. My sister-in-law saw her opportunity and stepped into the spotlight, her words carefully designed to provoke and publicly embarrass me. She questioned my professional judgment under the guise of jest, misrepresenting prior decisions I had made. The room's attention shifted, eyebrows raised, whispers exchanged. I inhaled quietly, a half-smile forming as I considered my response. I leaned in slightly, my tone calm but precise, correcting misconceptions with factual clarity. Her attempt to destabilize me faltered. The subtle use of wit, combined with composure, allowed me to maintain authority over the conversation, and the social energy began to tip in my favor. I felt a rush of controlled empowerment, the satisfaction of asserting my intelligence without resorting to aggression. Observers, friends, colleagues, neighbors watched closely. Their reactions were telling, slight nods, attentive expressions, and discreet glances that conveyed tentative support. My fiancé subtly reinforced my position, offering quiet affirmation while guiding the flow of dialogue away from any potential escalation. I took note, adjusting my own body language and responses to reinforce perceived control. Each measured exchange further highlighted my strategic awareness and emotional resilience, a contrast to my sister-in-law's increasingly frantic attempts to dominate the scene. Her smirk faltered slightly under the weight of her own overreach, and I seized the mental advantage, cataloging her vulnerabilities for future leverage. The turning point arrived during an ostensibly casual question from one of her allies, designed to undermine a previous accomplishment of mine. Instead of faltering, I reframed the topic, redirecting attention to shared successes and collaborative outcomes. The room leaned in, unspoken approval forming subtly among the guests. The overconfidence in her posture was now mine to exploit. Each of her gestures became transparent, and I maneuvered through the social landscape with deliberate precision. Empowerment coursed quietly through me. I had transformed the confrontation into a demonstration of competence and composure. The social tide was shifting, and the advantage, albeit precarious, was firmly in my grasp. In the reflective lull following the heated exchanges, I retreated momentarily to the privacy of the dining area. I allowed myself a few deep breaths, reviewing the night's events and reinforcing the lessons of patience, observation, and calculated assertiveness. I reminded myself that every move had consequences and that the ultimate confrontation would demand both moral and strategic grounding. My focus sharpened, readying for the decisive action I would undertake in the following chapter. The room behind me buzzed with quiet speculation, unaware that the true orchestration was happening in my mind and that I was several steps ahead. The night ended with a subtle, almost imperceptible challenge, a pointed glance from my sister-in-law, her lips curved in a knowing smile. It was a warning, an unspoken promise of further confrontation. I met her gaze steadily, allowing a calm, composed expression to mask the calculation behind it. The stage was set. The stakes were higher, the tension tangible, and I felt a surge of preparedness. I had navigated her provocations with intelligence and foresight, but I knew the ultimate test was yet to come. I was ready. The night was thick with anticipation as I moved toward the garden, each step measured, aware of the witnesses gathered behind me. My sister-in-law's earlier smirk had been a warning, a signal that tonight she intended to make her move. I reviewed every previous encounter in my mind, cataloging her patterns, predicting potential manipulations, and rehearsing my responses. Every glance I cast, every subtle gesture had to communicate confidence and control. My fiancé stayed close, a silent partner, ready to subtly reinforce my position without drawing attention. The air felt charged, almost electric, as family, neighbors, and colleagues subtly shifted closer to observe the unfolding drama. I drew in a steadying breath, feeling the mix of anxiety and focus. This was the culmination of weeks of careful observation, patience, and strategic restraint. I felt a quiet empowerment settling in. The stage was set, and I was prepared to confront her decisively while maintaining control over both the social and emotional dynamics at play. She struck quickly. What began as a casual conversation on the patio shifted abruptly when she made a pointed remark designed to publicly embarrass me regarding a professional decision I had made weeks before. Her voice carried that perfect blend of charm and venom, drawing the attention of everyone present. I paused, letting her words linger, observing reactions, eyebrows raised, whispered comments, subtle glances. Then I responded with calm precision. Facts, logic, and understated confidence formed my reply. I corrected her misrepresentation without aggression, letting the truth speak while maintaining composure. Each word was measured, every gesture deliberate. I could feel the audience shifting subtly, aligning with reason over theatrics. My controlled anger transformed into empowerment, and I recognized the satisfaction that comes from asserting one's integrity under scrutiny. The tension broke slightly in my favor, though I remained fully alert to any further provocation. Observers played their role silently. My fiancé's subtle nods, discreet encouragements, and attentive stance reinforced my authority without interrupting the flow. Colleagues and family friends registered my calm, measured demeanor against her increasingly desperate maneuvers. The social power dynamic tilted gradually, the subtle influence of these silent witnesses strengthening my position. Each interaction became a calculated chess move, every expression a tool to reinforce credibility and moral high ground. I absorbed it all, mentally noting which reactions signaled support and which were neutral or potentially aligned with her. Confidence coursed through me, but caution tempered it. A misstep could shift the delicate balance. The decisive moment arrived with clarity. My sister-in-law attempted a direct challenge, leveraging digital evidence to undermine a previous project I had led. I had anticipated this. A tablet displaying selective screenshots was placed in her hand for dramatic effect. I approached, took a composed breath, and reframed the context calmly, highlighting overlooked facts and clarifying misconceptions. Her maneuver collapsed under the weight of reason and strategy. Observers' reactions subtly shifted to recognition of my preparedness and authority. The satisfaction was palpable. Years of careful patience and observation culminated in this moment of reversal. She faltered, her overconfidence laid bare, while my strategic foresight had ensured control of the narrative and the social standing within the group. In the aftermath, a quiet resolution settled over the garden. The tension among witnesses dissipated, and the subtle social consequences for my sister-in-law began to manifest. Furtive glances, hesitant comments, and the faintest signs of reconsideration in her posture. I reflected inwardly, acknowledging the empowerment that came from both endurance and strategic action. My moral and emotional grounding remained intact, and the lessons reinforced. Intelligence, patience, and composure were the ultimate tools in navigating manipulation. The night felt quieter now, though still charged with the awareness that long-term social dynamics would continue to evolve. I had stood my ground decisively, demonstrating both capability and resilience. As the gathering began to disperse, her final glance was almost imperceptible but loaded with meaning, a silent acknowledgement of defeat mixed with lingering tension. I met it steadily, allowing a composed expression to mask the satisfaction and quiet triumph swelling within me. Yet a part of me recognized the lingering effects that might take time to resolve fully, both for her and for the broader circle of family and friends. This confrontation had reached its peak, but the emotional and social reverberations would continue, offering opportunities for reflection, growth, and cautious optimism. I felt prepared for the remaining challenges, the sense of closure tempered with readiness for the lessons yet to come. Morning light filtered gently through the windows, casting a calm glow over the study where I sat, reflecting on the events that had unraveled over the past weeks. I traced each confrontation in my mind, noting the precise moments when patience had been tested and strategies executed. The empowerment I felt now was quiet but undeniable, a deep-rooted awareness that my composure and intelligence had carried me through every provocation. I allowed myself a moment of subdued pride, acknowledging the resilience I had cultivated. My fiancé joined me, offering the reassuring presence I had come to rely on, his calm voice helping me articulate lessons learned and future considerations. Together, we reviewed the social dynamics, the subtle victories, and the enduring principles that had guided my actions. There was a reflective satisfaction in knowing that standing firm, observing carefully, and responding strategically had not only protected my integrity, but had reinforced my self-worth in ways that no external validation could surpass. Later, as friends, extended family, and colleagues gathered for a quiet brunch in the backyard, the social landscape subtly shifted. Those who had witnessed the previous confrontations now acknowledged my poise and reasoning, their gestures of support nuanced but perceptible. My sister-in-law's influence waned. The minor social and emotional consequences of her actions were evident in her hesitant mannerisms and muted remarks. Conversations flowed more naturally around me, with compliments and recognition of my professional and personal acumen offered in passing, unobtrusively validating the stance I had maintained. I felt relief mingle with cautious optimism. Relief that the tension had eased, optimism for the improved family dynamics that now seemed attainable. Observing these subtle shifts, I noted which relationships required continued nurturing and which boundaries remained critical to preserve my emotional equilibrium. The afternoon found me engaging in personal projects, rekindling professional ambitions, and nurturing relationships with those closest to me. I mentored a younger relative navigating career decisions, drawing upon my own experiences to guide without overstepping. Conversations with friends reflected mutual respect and shared understanding, reinforcing connections I had cultivated over time. The lingering anger and frustration from past manipulations gradually released, replaced by hope and empowerment. In these moments, the routine tasks of life carried a renewed significance. Every interaction, every small achievement reaffirmed my self-worth. The garden, the quiet corners of my home, and even digital correspondence became arenas for thoughtful engagement, reflecting both growth and forward movement. By evening, small echoes of previous tensions surfaced, A brief message from my sister-in-law tinged with residual guilt, a subtle gesture hinting at awareness of her missteps. I observed calmly, recognizing the continued consequences she faced socially and emotionally. A symbolic object left in the garden, a gift she had previously offered, now seemed to reflect the resolution of old grievances. I allowed myself a reflective smile, amused by the poetic symmetry. This subtle acknowledgement, coupled with her restrained presence in conversations, reaffirmed the lessons of strategy, patience, and moral standing I had internalized. I understood that while complete reconciliation might not occur immediately, the social and emotional landscape had shifted firmly in favor of clarity and justice. In the quiet of night, I sat alone for a final reflection, considering the broader narrative of resilience and self-respect. The conflicts, confrontations, and subtle power plays had left tangible lessons. Intelligence, patience, and strategic action are enduring tools against manipulation. I addressed these insights internally, aware that growth and empowerment were ongoing processes. The social consequences for my sister-in-law were clear, yet the ultimate victory lay not in revenge, but in measured, dignified assertion of self. The moral takeaway crystallized. Integrity and composure create outcomes that endure beyond immediate gratification, leaving space for personal evolution and lasting respect. As the evening wound down, a sense of hope mingled with quiet satisfaction. Opportunities for continued personal development, strengthened relationships, and occasional reconciliation were on the horizon. I closed my journal, feeling the weight of past tensions lift, and allowed myself a final pause, reflecting on the subtle but profound victories achieved. Sometimes, justice comes quietly, and growth is the real victory. The day ended not with confrontation, but with understanding, calm strength, and the promise of a future shaped by wisdom rather than fear.